This Sicha, in addition to being a Sicha related to the Parshas HaShavua, it's also a Siyum on Masechta Sukkah. It was customary that the Rebbe would make Siyumim on the days of Yortzeit and the days of Hilula. And this Sicha is actually put together from two Sichas, one of Vav Tishrei Sicha, the Yortzeit of the Rebbe's mother, Rebbe Tzanchana, and a Chaf Av Sicha, the Yortzeit of the Rebbe's father, Rebbe Levi Yitzchok. In this Sicha, the Rebbe is going to be exploring the relationship between neighbors, and the main topic in the Sicha is going to be whether the connection between neighbors is what we would call more of a superficial type of connection, where one is impacted by the other or even benefiting from the other in one way or another, or is there a much deeper connection between the neighbors? And the Rebbe is going to be looking at this in three completely different areas, seemingly, of Torah. And the Rebbe starts off the Sicha and says, the Pasuk says, V'yalsiso hayashar v'hatoiv be'enei Hashem, you should do that which is just and right and good in the eyes of Hashem. From this we learn out the halacha which is called bar metzora. Bar metzora literally means the one living at the border of your property. And that is, that if a person buys a field from another person, so the bar metzora, the one who has a field neighboring the sold field, has the right to remove this new buyer from the field and to now pay for it and buy the field himself, because it's a benefit for him, for this bar metzora, for this neighbor, to have his properties, his fields next to each other. Now, this din of bar metzora, as it's brought in the Gemara and Paskin in the Rambam as well, is specifically when the buyer has already bought the field, so as a result of our siso hayashar v'atoiv, so we remove this person that just bought the field, and then, as we said, we give it to the other person. But which tells us that the chiyuv, the main obligation of our siso hayashar v'atoiv, is on the buyer, on the one that just bought this field. In other words, it's not so much about the seller who sold the field to start with, it's more about this person who just bought the field. Since for him there's not such a major difference if he buys this field or another field somewhere else, as opposed to the neighbor, the bar metzora, it makes a big difference for him, and therefore we say it's yashar v'toiv, it's the right thing, it's the good thing, that this bar metzora should be able to buy this field. The Rebbe says, this is also implied from the Gemara that says that Zovin la'akum, if the owner of the field went ahead and sold it to a goy, then there is no din of bar metzora, because there's definitely no concept of asiso hayashar v'hatoiv, no obligation on the goy as far as we asiso hayashar v'hatoiv. In other words, what do we see from here? That this whole din, this whole obligation is on the buyer, and therefore it doesn't apply when it was sold to a goy. However, says the Rebbe, within the geder of bar metzora itself, within the law of bar metzora itself, this itself we could explain in two different ways. One way of explaining it is that it's just a matter of hanhagis yesharis v'toivos, meaning it's just a way of how this buyer should conduct himself. That means he bought the field 100%. There's nothing lacking in his acquisition of the field. But the Chachamim are now telling him that he needs to fulfill what this pasuk says, V'asiso hayashar v'hatoiv. The Chachamim are telling him that he needs to act in an upright and a just way, and therefore, yes, it's true he acquired this field, but now he should be giving it to the bar metzora. Obviously, the bar metzora is going to pay for it. But it's mainly, again, on Hagatoiva. It's not that it actually belongs to the bar metzora in any way. We're telling this person how you should act and give it now to this bar metzora. And the same thing we would understand in other laws related to bar metzora as well. Another way of understanding it is that if Yasiso hayashar v'hatoiv actually accomplishes that this bar metzora, this neighbor, to a certain extent, actually got a certain ownership on the field because he's a neighbor. And therefore, the fact that this buyer needs to give the field to the bar metzora, it's not only an obligation of a nice thing to do, a good way of behaving, but rather this field inherently belongs in some way to the bar metzora. Or to use the expression of the Nemuke Yosef that says, Ki ilu yesh lo ktsas kinyan begufo shel karka. It's as if he had already acquired some of this piece of land, and therefore the buyer is obligated to give it to him. Okay, now the difference between these two ways, says the Rebbe, according to the first way, that the din of the bar metzora is only a matter of acting in a good and nice way, then who is the din being said to? It's being said to, it's purely on the loikeach, on the one who just bought the field, that he needs to act in a just way, in a good way, and give the field to the bar metzora. If he doesn't, then Bezdin even gets involved and forces him to, but it's mainly a chiyuv on him. On the other hand, according to the second way, that it's a din in the actual acquisition of the piece of land. So even though that the v'asiso hayosher v'atoiv practically is being told and directed also to this buyer, but this tzivui, this obligation, and fulfilling it practically is also very relevant to the Beis Din as well. Because as a result of the v'asiso hayosher v'atoiv, what we're saying is that the chachamim are actually making and giving this bar metzora a certain kinyan, a certain portion of owning this field. In other words, that when the buyer had bought the field from the original seller, to a certain extent the Chachamim are weakening his kinyan, the amount that he owns it, and it's as a result of this that the buyer now needs to be removed. He needs to remove himself and allow the bar metzora, who to a certain extent owned this land already, to be able to have it. Says the Rebbe, based on this, would actually come out that this is a machloikis amongst the Rishonim. We could see this in the words of these Rishonim, how each one is leaning towards one of these ways. And specifically this will be emphasized in the differences of opinion between Rashi and the Rambam. On this Gemara in the din of Bar Metzora, because of Asiso Hayosher V'atoiv, Rashi says, Davar she'i ata nechsar kolkach, something that you, the buyer, are not going to lose so much, because you'll be able to find land somewhere else. So therefore, you should allow now this bar metzora to have it, so that he doesn't have to have the bother to have his properties in different places. Allow him to have his properties next to each other. The Rambam, on the other hand, explains the reason, and this is what he says. Yesh lachaveiroi, shehu b'tzad hametzar, the one who is the neighbor, who has his field by the border, has the right to come along and give the buyer money and to remove him. And that's because the pasuk says, "V'yasiso hayashar v'atoiv." The Chachamim explained that to mean that since this sale is a good one and a just one, it is the right thing that he should be the one buying it, the Ben HaMeitzah, because it's right and just for him more than some foreigner, some other person coming in here. In other words, according to Rashi, the emphasis is on the buyer that's on Haga Toiva, that it's a good way of the way he should conduct himself. Completely applying to the Loikeach. How does Rashi put it? Davar she'iyata nechsa, something that you, the buyer, are not losing out anything by having your field somewhere else. Don't cause the Ben HaMeitzah to have a bother to split up his fields. And as Rashi emphasizes it in the Gemara by the din of if one sold it to a goy, the goy doesn't have this obligation of Siso Hayashar V'atoiv. Rashi explains, Ve'ein lanu loymar, we cannot say this concept of Bar Metzor V'asiso Hayashar V'atoiv, who do we say it to? We only say it to the Loikeach, to the buyer. To the buyer we say, remove your hands, remove yourself from this field, let this other person come and buy it. And again, that's why we wouldn't say this to the goy. However, what does the Rambam say? According to the Rambam, it's not only a matter of Anhaga Toiva, that the Loikeach, the buyer, has to be acting in a certain way for the benefit of the neighbor. But rather, again, it becomes something inherent within the field and the way one's supposed to act. In other words, the fact that the Chachamim say that this is the Toiv Yosher, and again, who is the Chachamim mainly saying it to? They're saying it to the Bar Metzora, that this Bar Metzora has the right to come along and remove the person who just bought it. Because the Chachamim said, V'asiso hayashar v'atoiv means that it's the right thing that he should be able to buy it. In other words, what they're saying is, and where the Rambam is putting it, that this is the actual right thing, completely what has to happen as far as the field is concerned, as far as this neighbor is concerned. And that's again coming with the koyach that the Chachamim gave the Bar Metzora to own the land to a certain extent. So who is it being told? It's not being told that Loikeach, he should act in a nice way. We're saying that this bar metzora can now come along and actually demand it and take the other person off it. Says the Rebbe, with this we're going to understand that by the din of selling to a goy, the Rambam puts it a little bit differently than the way we find it in the Gemara. The Rambam says, HaMoicher lahakum, someone that went ahead and sold it to a goy, we put him into a shamto, like a kind of excommunication, until he accepts upon himself anything that may go wrong between the goy, who's now going to be this new neighbor, and the bar metzora that's living there. We're going to make sure that this seller is going to be responsible for any oinus that happens from this goy until he acts with the bar metzora in the proper way of Dinei Yisrael. In other words, first of all, he removes what the reason it says in the Gemara that says that the goy, the concept of al siso ayosher v'atoiv, doesn't apply to him. He also adds to the words of the Gemara that says yinoik, till the goy will act with the bar metzar in the dinim of in the dinim of a yid. In other words, because this din of bar metzora is not, as we said before, only about the loikeach, that he has to act in a way of yosher v'toiv, but it's more connected with the property itself, with the piece of land itself, and not only again on the loikeach. Now, this is as far as bar metzora is concerned. The Rebbe is now going to apply this to different areas of Torah, and the Rebbe says, we spoke many times that there's many inyonim of halachis and Torah that even though at first glance they seem to be completely unrelated to each other, nevertheless, because we know that Torah is a Torah achas, if we look deeply, properly, we'll find that there's a certain common thread, a common denominator. Or we'll find that they're all built, certain different things that seem to be not related, are built on the same yisoid, on the same basis, on the same foundation, as we find this in the Sfarim of a number of Gedolei Yisrael, specifically regarding the Ragachover we find this. Says the Rebbe, based on what we just explained of these two ways of understanding bar metzora, that really there is a general discussion over here, a general geder, and we're looking at it in two different ways. Whether the neighboring causes an inner and intrinsic connection between the neighbors, the fact that they're neighbors to each other. In other words, there's something really being changed over here. For example, again, in the case of the field, we're saying that the neighbor, to a certain degree, actually owns some of the other neighbor's property. Or we say that it's just a external connection. They just happen to be next to each other, and therefore it's only an obligation of a nice way of acting, that the way people should act is that you should, first allow the neighbor to have it, etc., but it's not that the neighbor actually is connected to it in any way. Says the Rebbe that this idea, we're going to be able to apply it in different areas as well. It's going to come out as an afkamina in different areas as well. And the Rebbe is going to look over here in three general areas in the famous expression, which the Sefer Yetzirah uses, that our world has oilam, shana, and nefesh. Oilam is space, shana is time, and nefesh is in people. So in space, in oilam, that's what we were just discussing, pieces of land next to each other, the neighbors in the din of bar metzora. Now the Rebbe looks at a similar concept in the inyan of shana and the inyan of time. And the Rebbe says, we know there's the concept of toisvis mechoyle la kodesh, that when it comes to, first of all, for example, Yom Kippur, there's an idea of adding some of the holiness of Yom Kippur. And the Rebbe says, L'divrei hakal, everyone agrees that this is min haTorah, that we start off a little bit earlier, not only when it's actually a nightfall according to Torah, but we start a little bit earlier, adding a little bit more. Shabbos and Yom Tov, there's a similar concept of starting a little bit before the actual time of Shabbos and Yom Tov. Now, there's some opinions that it's midoraisa, some opinions midrabanan, but there's generally this idea. So the Rebbe says this is also a concept of neighbors, of neighboring, because we have the time before Shabbos, and the time or after Shabbos is the same idea. This is all like the neighbors close to Shabbos, and the Rebbe says we can look at this again in two different ways. So one way is that they're actually intrinsically connected. There's a real connection. That means that the time that's right before or right after Shabbos, because it's so close to Shabbos, the time itself is changed. It's actually getting some of the essence, some of the holiness of Shabbos is there. Another way of understanding it is, no, the time itself never got the Kedusha of Shabbos. But since it's so close to Shabbos, so there's an obligation on the person. He has to now start getting ready and getting prepared, getting into the Shabbos mode. Says the Rebbe, based on what we said before, we can now understand that this is going to be the explanation for a machloikas that we find in Poskim. Whether in this time that we add to Shabbos, that little time before Shabbos, could we then make Kiddush on Shabbos and other similar sorts of halachis? What's the two ways of looking at it? So the Rebbe says, those opinions that would say that you could make Kiddush at that point, you could have the Shabbos at that point, and similar sorts of idea, that's because they're looking at it in a way that the time before Shabbos, and the same thing again would apply after Shabbos, actually has fully that Kedusha of Shabbos and Yom Tov. In other words, there's a more intrinsic connection. The Rebbe preempts a certain question over here right now in the square brackets, and the Rebbe says, now we know that Pesach you cannot make Kiddush and do Achilas Matzah in that time that's before nightfall. But that's not really a question and a contradiction to what we're saying over here. Because in those cases, those mitzvahs, the Dalet Koises and Matzah, are actually connected not only with the Kedusha of Pesach, but it's actually connected with the fact that it needs to be night. And therefore, just because a time is just before nighttime, is not going to become that now it's night. But as far as the Kedusha again, usually Shabbos, Yom Tov, and whatever, how it applies to Yom Kippur, these opinions hold that the Kedusha actually entered and affects that time of the day. On the other hand, those opinions that say that the additional part that we added to Shabbos or Yom Kippur is only as far as that a person is not allowed to do malacha, but you can't go ahead and make Kiddush, for example. What are they holding? Because they're saying that the time that we're adding to Shabbos or Yom Tov is more of like an external connection to the time of Shabbos. It's not mamish part of Shabbos. And therefore, you could only add as far as what you're concerned. In your not doing work, for example, you'd be able to say, fine, I'm adding a little bit to Shabbos and I'm not doing work at this point as well. But you can't go ahead and fulfill those mitzvahs that are actually connected with the time of Shabbos. And now the Rebbe moves on to nefesh, to people, how people affect each other, neighboring people, so to speak. And the Rebbe says, in the end of Masechta Sukkah, we have that the Mishnah says, at the very end, we know that the Kohanim were generally divided into 24 mishmoros, 24 groups that took turns working in the Beis HaMikdash. These different groups had names based on people in the family. So there was a mishmor called Bilga. And usually we know that the halacha is, we had a mishmor that was just coming into work for the new week. There was a mishmor that was just leaving. And then there are various different things that are related to the karbonos and other things that the kohanim get, that the kohanim, the mishmor needs to be splitting, it needs to be dividing between themselves, etc. So the halacha goes as follows, that the new mishmor that's coming in divides in the tzafon. They distribute their things in the tzafon in the north part of the Azara. Tzafon is usually considered holier, etc. The one going out distributes it in the Dorim in the south. But this mishmar called Bilga, that was the name of this particular mishmar, they would always distribute their things in the Dorim, meaning they would be always similar, as if they're just finishing off, rather having the extra holiness of the tzafon. And another two differences between this mishmar and the other mishmaros, one is that tabat, or its ring, was kavua, was set, was locked in place. We'll soon discuss what that means. That's going to be the major discussion soon, what this is all about. V'chaloina, and its window, like a kabi, like a locker, like a type of place, a shelf where to hold things, was stuma, was also always closed off. Again, we'll soon see what this chaloin refers to. Now, what was the reason for all of this? So, the Gemara brings two reasons. One is because of a certain girl of this family, Miriam Bas Bilga, that had converted, and the Gemara goes on to tell a whole long story of how she disgraced the Mizbeach and so on and so forth. The Rebbe does not go into the story over here. Another reason that the Gemara gives is because this particular mishmar was lax in their avodah. They would come late, they didn't show up on time, etc. Now, so this is why they got a knas, because of one of these two reasons. The Gemara goes on and asks, I could understand, based on the reason that this mishmar would always come late, so that's why the whole mishmar is getting this penalty of the few things that we just mentioned. However, according to the opinion that it was because of a certain girl, Miriam Bas Bilga, that converted, so just because of this daughter, this girl, that is why the father should be punished. Miriam Bas Bilga, that's why Bilga should be punished. So the Gemara says, yes, because we know there's a saying that people say, that Shusa di Yanuka, meaning that which a child speaks, Bishuka, out in the street, where did he pick it up from? Either from his father or from his mother. So therefore, yes, the parents are being punished because of the daughter. So then the Gemara goes on and says, and just because of the parents, that's why the whole Mishmar should be punished? So Abaye explains, Oy l'Rasha, oy l'Shchenoi. That yes, woe is to the Rasha, woe is to the neighbor. Again, we're soon going to explain what exactly that means in this context. Then the Gemara goes on and says, in a similar way, there's Toiv l'Tzadik, Toiv l'Shchenoi, and the Gemara brings a pasuk, Imru Tzadik ki Toiv, say to the Tzadik or about the Tzadik, ki Toiv, that the things he does are all good, ki prima loleim yechelu, and they eat the fruits of their labor. Again, we'll soon see what the pshat in that pasuk is. Now, the first thing that Rebbe establishes is that from the fact that the Gemara's main discussion is regarding that reason of Miriam Bas Bilga, that seems to tell us that that's actually the main reason of why the Mishmar got punished. This is based on a rule that we know that the one that the Gemara is more elaborating on seems to be that's the one the Gemara is accepting. Now, Rashi, on these words at the very end of the Gemara, Mikan Amru, Oy l'Rasha, Oy l'Shchenoi. From here we see this idea, Oy l'Rasha, Oy l'Shchenoi. And then Rashi says the following, Umemela, and therefore automatically we also know that Toiv l'Tzadik, Toiv l'Shchenoi. How do we know that automatically? Because Midah, Toiv Meruba, we know that in good, the measure of good is always greater and better than the negative. Now, we just said before that there's a pasuk to prove this idea of Toiv l'Tzadik, Toiv l'Shchenoi. We brought a pasuk of Imru Tzadik. Says that ever from the fact that Rashi is saying that we know it from Midah, Toiv Meruba, that tells us that Rashi didn't have this girsa in the Gemara of this pasuk of Imru Tzadik. In fact, in some prints of the Gemara, this pasuk doesn't appear. So we need to understand the reason. What is really the difference? Whether we're learning the proof from the pasuk Imru Tzadik Itoy, which again we'll discuss what the proof is soon, or the proof is from Midah Toiv Meruba. In order to understand all of this, let's first go back to understand what is the meaning of those two penalties that the Mishmar had besides the north and the south. Darim and Tzafon, we spoke about that the ring was set in place, and Chaloinos Tuma, and that its locker, its kabi, was closed off. In this we find two pirushim. So Rashi explains, Tabata Kvua refers to the rings that were in the Azara, in the place where the animals were shechted. They would be attached to the stones of the floor. This was a ring that was able to move around in a way that it could open and close, so that you could open it up, put the neck of the animal into the ring, then you close it back down to the floor, and now it's sort of locked, so the animal can be held in place by the shchita. That's Rashi's explanation. So in the case of Bilga, of that Mishmar, that ring was totally always locked in place. It wouldn't be able to be turned to be opened and closed, so it wouldn't be able to use it. That was its penalty, and would always have to use a different Mishmar's ring. What does Chaloinos Tuma mean? Again, related to Shchita, according to Rashi. Rashi says that there were these Chaloinos, these windows, these kabis, in the Beis HaChalifos, in the place where they held the Chalafim, the knives, that was in the walls of these toim, of these, between the walls of the Beis HaMikdash, there were these spaces in which their knives would be kept. Again, the locker, the kabi of Bilga was not available. They weren't able to use their own. So, but the point is that according to Rashi, both things, the tabas and the chaloin, is related to shchita and to the things we use for the shchita. According to the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos, he says something very different. What does he say? It means tabat kvuah v'chaloinos tuma. So tabat kvuah, says the Rambam, every mishmar had a ring that was actually hanging on the wall. We're not speaking about a ring on the floor. It was hanging on the wall. These rings were used to hang the animal when we needed to skin the animal. After it was already shechted and all of that, it needed to be skinned, so it was hung by that ring. And again, the ring of the Mishmar of Bilga was set in place, wasn't able to be opened, wasn't able to be used, to hint that because of this punishment. So again, there's this idea that all the other ones, the Rambam goes on to explain that there were 24 of these rings for the 24 mishmaris, but again, this mishmar wasn't able to use it. In a similar way, there was 24 windows or lockers, kabis, and this was for the big day kahuna. Each mishmar again had its own. So the tabas, this ring for skinning the carbon, and the chaloin for big day kahuna. What is the main difference, says the Rebbe, between these two pirushim? According to Rashi, the knas of Bilga was in things, they're all related to Shchita, we said. It was things that are actually possible that even women should be able to do. Because Shchita, as we know, is ksheira bezorim uvenashim. Even someone that's not a kohen and even a woman could perform Shchita. And even lechatchila, someone that's not a kohen, and in this case the nashim, could go ahead and shecht. Now, even though technically it needs to be within the space of the azara where she can't go, but she could be standing right outside with a bit of a longer knife and she could shecht. However, mikabala v'elach, from the moment that the animal is shechted, now we're receiving the blood, etc., this must be done by a kohen. According to the Rambam, again, both the chalif and the rings are in Yonam to do with shchita, according to Rashi. So again, shchita is something that's shaykh to women. However, according to the Rambam, what kind of knas is being given over here? Things that are definitely not shaykh for the women to do. First of all, they cannot be skinning the karbonos. Why is that? Because these were rings that were in a place in the Azara, definitely that the woman would not be able to be there. And certainly not big day kahuna, which are for the purpose of avodah. Because the women are not able to do the avodah. And the Rebbe says, so what's really the machloikas going on over here? What's the basis for those machloikas? So the Rebbe says, according to Rashi, we're giving a knas to the whole mishmar. It's really, like we said before, just like a neighbor that's ending up suffering the consequences because he's next to a bad neighbor. So in other words, what kind of knas is being given? It's the kind of knas that even this girl herself technically are things that she could have done, because she could have shechted, so she's getting, in a certain sense, she's getting the main knas, because her ring is being locked and the knives that she would have been able to use are being, not able to use the regular lockers. So it's things that are shaykh to her, and because of that, the rest of this mishmar is suffering. So the punishment is the kind of punishment that's emphasizing that it's really all things to do with her. On the other hand, the Rambam, what kind of knas is it? It's things that have nothing to do with this girl herself. It's things that she wouldn't have been able to do, but rather now the whole mishmar somehow is being punished in another area. How do we understand this? Because this goes back to the idea of neighbors. Is the neighboring affecting a real inner change in the other neighbor, to the extent that we say that now the neighbor was impacted in a real way, or are we saying no, it's only an external connection? How does this play out in this case? Again, Rashi and the Rambam, like we said before. According to Rashi, we said the neighboring is only impacting in a chitzoni is the way, not really affecting the shachen inside the shachen himself. Like we said by bar metzra, that it's only a way that you need to behave towards your shachen, towards the neighbor. But it's not really that the neighbor owns anything. And therefore, as we'll see in a moment, it's going to apply to how the knas goes over here with the knives. But first the Rebbe says that this generally fits with the way Rashi usually goes to explain things more al pi pshat, and the idea of when we say kansina lekula mishmar, the way the Gemara discusses, do we give a knas to the whole mishmar? It does sound like, yes, that's all it is. It's just a penalty that they're getting because of the rasha. So what does Rashi say? That the punishment that they're getting, the disgrace, the embarrassment that they're getting is only because they were a neighbor, so to speak, that this girl is part of and close to them. And again, it's going to be only in things that she could have had some sort of connection to, that she could have done. So it's as a result, because she can't use it, so therefore they're neighbors, so they're also suffering. According to the Rambam, however, it's a much deeper connection between the neighbors. In our case, what Oile Shchene means, not only an external thing, you're being punished, you're suffering the consequences because you were close by. But rather what we're saying is that because you're next to a Rasha, in this case, this girl, that affected this mishmar, that they themselves should become bad in some way. And therefore, as we'll soon see, the punishment is going to be a much bigger punishment, not only in the area of shchita, as we'll soon get back to in a minute, but first again, the Rebbe discusses that this fits very much with the Rambam's opinion in Hilchos Deis, who speaks very strongly about the idea that it's the derech b'riyasa shel adam, that is the way of a person, that he's drawn in his character and his action, in the way he behaves, based on his friends and his acquaintances, his colleagues, as the Rambam elaborates. So therefore, going back to the punishment and disgrace in this case, it's not just limited to a punishment that, because my neighbor, something happened to my neighbor, there's a certain punishment, the penalty, so that penalty is affecting me also. We're saying no, because we were neighbors, so the evil itself of the neighbor impacted this mishmar, and therefore they're going to be punished in all things that are related to them in a more general way, not only the things where this girl was punished. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand the proof in regards to Toiv L'Tzadik, Toiv L'Shchenai. Whether, as we have our Girs in the Gemara, it's because of the Pasuk Imru Tzadik Hi Toiv, or because of the Svar of Meruba Midah Toiva. Says the Rebbe like this. Let's look at the Pasuk. Imru Tzadik Hi Toiv, Ki Prima Alaleim Yechelu. What does this mean simply? That's the pasuk starts off b'lashon yachid. Imru, say tzaddik ki toiv, that the tzaddik is good, the things that the tzaddik does are good. Then it concludes b'lashon rabim, keprima loleihem yoichelu, the fruits of their labor they will eat. What is this pasuk teaching us? The point that we're speaking about of toiv l'tzaddik, toiv l'shchenoi, that even those that were near the tzaddik, they're going to eat the fruits together with the tzaddik, because it started in singular tzaddik, and then we're speaking about fruits in plural. But that's not all, says the Rebbe. Because seemingly it should have said, Ki prima lolov yoichelu. Yes, we're speaking about the fruits. They will eat the fruits, in plural. It's going to be them. The other people are going to eat the fruits. But it should have said, ma'alolov, of his labor. Ma'aloleihem sounds the fruits of their labor. If we're speaking about the fruits of labor of the tzaddik, it should have said, ma'alolov. Says the Rebbe, that itself is really the proof the Gemara is trying to say. That because of the neighboring, it's not only that they're getting the reward of the tzaddik, his fruit, but furthermore, that now it becomes the fruit of their labor. Because as we explained, that right now, according to one of the ways of looking at it, as we'll see, this is going to be fitting more with the Rambam, that it became a much more intrinsic connection. So because of them neighboring the tzaddik, they became good now. They're now eating the fruits of their own labor. However, of course, it still starts off with Imru Tzaddik and singular Kitoiv. We're telling the Tzaddik, or about the Tzaddik, we're speaking about the praise of the Tzaddik, because the fruits of the labor that they're eating is coming because they were neighbors of the Tzaddik. That's why they learned from him, and that's why they became different. So now that would fit again with the Shita of the Rambam. But we said that Rashi doesn't bring this pasuk. So now we understand why. If we said that the neighboring, according to Rashi, doesn't really impact and transform the neighbor himself, rather it remains an external shaychus, so therefore we can't bring this pasuk of Imru Tzadik Toiv, which emphasizes an intrinsic and internal connection. Therefore he brings the proof of Toiv L'Tzadik, Toiv L'Shchenoi, because of the Svara of Meruba Midah Toiva, that if we find by the bad, that because of neighboring a Rasha, there's Oil L'Shchenoi, then how much more so when your neighbors are the Tzadik, there's the concept of Toiv L'Tzadik, Toiv L'Shchenoi. But the Rebbe says seemingly this is not still completely so glottic, still completely so smooth and understood. Why is that? Because why does Rashi have to come on to this idea of Meruba Midah Toiva, that in a good measure things are even better? Seemingly, even if good and bad would just be equals, that should have still been enough to say, if Oile Rasha, Oile Shchenoi, then so too, we understand the same logic, Toiv L'Tzadik, Toiv L'Shchenoi. So the Rebbe explains, the fact that we go ahead and we punish the Mishmar of Bilga is really an oynesh that didn't impact, as we said in a very pneumistic way, we didn't really change the whole Mishmar in any way. It's more of a chitzoynistic thing. That means we didn't take away the avoida of this Mishmar. We only took away, not even a part of the avoida. It's only a certain level of disgrace, of embarrassment regarding certain details on the order of the avoida. Says the Rebbe, that fits with the concept of Oile Rosh, Oile Shchene generally. Why? Because when we speak about punishment and negative things b'chlal regarding a Yid, it's always going to be only a chitzoyni, it's an external thing. It's never going to be an inyan pnimi. As we know that the Razal say, even regarding a very, very harsh punishment, the harshest punishment. This is a story with Achan, where he was being punished for his Aveiros and being killed, and yet he's being told, that in Olam Haba, he's still going to have a portion in Olam Haba. He's not messed up, he's not soiled, so to speak, as far as Olam Haba is concerned. The Pnimiyus Yid always remains pure. Because this fits with the general idea that evil and bad by a Yid is always going to be only something external, only something secondary, not really part of his Metzias. And therefore, even the punishment is only a temporary thing and an external thing. But when we speak about Toiv l'Tzadik, Toiv l'Shchenoi, the good that comes from being the neighbor of a Tzadik, it's going to be a more Pnimiyistic good and a more everlasting and eternal good. It affects the person, the Yid and the Pnimiyus. And therefore, says the Rebbe, it's not enough just to say Toiv l'Tzadik, Toiv l'Shchenoi, the same way as Oil l'Rosh, Oil l'Shchenoi, because as said, the neighboring, being a neighbor, b'chitzoini is to the Rasha, is the pu'ula, the effect is also always going to be just a very chitzoini is the one. However, when one is a neighbor with a tzaddik, even if seemingly there's only an external connection and not really bound and connected in a pnimiyistic way, nevertheless, the tzaddik is poil in a pnimiyistic way on his shchenim, on the yidden that are next to him, and brings them good more in a pnimiyistic way as well. And this is why Rashi has to say meruba mida toiv, that mida toiv meruba, because that's going to emphasize and explain to us that the toiv l'shcheni of the tzaddik is very different than the way it works by the Rashi, because here, in fact, it is really a pu'ula and a hamshacha pnimis. Now, the Rebbe is going to go back and connect it to the idea of to the three things really together, Bar Metzra and Shabbos. The Rebbe says, this idea of Oile Rasha, Oile Shchenoi, and Toiv l'Tzadik, Toiv l'Shchenoi, really, and this is also into the two general ideas that we find regarding the other neighboring things that we spoke about Bar Metzra and Tois Shabbos and Yom Tov. The Rebbe explains, what's the idea of Oile Rasha, Oile Shchenoi, and Avodas Adam? The concept of Oy represents a concept of pain. We see by the nature of people, when someone is in very, very deep pain, it's expressed when he screams out and he says, Oy! And we know that the pain for Averis, that's the Avodah of Tshuva, that breaks and nullifies the Ra. Within this itself, says the Rebbe, there's two ideas. There's the concept of the Oile Rosh and Oile Shchenoi. In other words, it's more about focusing on the Ra, breaking the bad, the Avodah of Sur Meira. In the Avodah and the Nefesh, that would be more the idea of Meriris, bitterness, Koived Roish, etc. And then there is Toiv L'Tzadik, the Avodah of the Asay Toiv, more the Kav of Simcha, of joy, of happiness. When a Yid works on himself in both of these areas, both in the getting rid of the negative and the positive, so then there's the idea of also Oy L'Shchenoi, in other words, getting rid of the bad and nullifying the bad, the Sur Meira also by the neighbor, in other words, not only by myself, but also it impacts my neighbor as well. And so too, when I do good, Toiv L'Shchenoi, it impacts my neighbor as well, in V'asei Toiv. Now, in the world in general, where would this be expressed? Where would we see these two general ideas of Sur Meira, V'asei Toiv, would be and impacting the neighbors, would be in these two halachas that we spoke about before, of Bar Metzra and Tosfos Shabbos V'Yom Tov. Bar Metzra simply is obligating the person to act in a way against his nature, giving away something that he bought in order not to cause harm or even a bother to someone else. In other words, this is something more related to the concept of Sur Meira. And so too, says the Rebbe, the general idea of Bar Metzra is again related more, not so much to the holy inyanim of the world, not so much to the inyan of Kedusha and mitzvahs, it's more relating to the mundane, the simple things of the world, a field, inyanei harishus, and therefore, again, more related to the concept of how careful we need to be with these things. So it's more a Sur Meira type of mode. On the other hand, says the Rebbe, Tosfos Shabbos V'Yom Tov is speaking about Inyanim of Asay Toiv. It's about adding in Inyanim of Shabbos and Yom Tov, adding in Toiv, adding in Kedusha in the world. Says the Rebbe, based on all of this, the Rebbe is specifically focusing on the second pirush of Oile Rasha, Oile Shchenoi, and the way we just explained this whole idea of tshuva and so on and so forth, the Rebbe says we're going to understand something that it says in the Megala Amukos. So he brings that Elul is a Rasha Tevis, Oil Rasha, Ve'oil Shchenoi. Now seemingly you could ask, Elul is a Chodesh HaRachamim V'Aslichos. So what does this all have to do with seemingly all this negativity and punishment? Oile Rasha, Oile Shchenoi. Based on the way we explained it, the Rebbe says like this: Oile Rasha means breaking the bad through tshuva, through the tshuva of Chodesh Elul. And Oile Shchenoi means, who is the neighbor? We also get rid of, and we break the bad, not only in Chodesh Elul getting rid of and doing tshuva, but it also impacts the neighbor, which is Chodesh Av, which comes right before Elul. And the Rebbe explains. It says in the Zohar that the months that belong to Yaakov Avinu are the months of Nisan, Iyar, and Sivan. These months are considered months of Kedusha, of positivity, and connected to Yaakov Avinu. The Zohar then also discusses the months that are Shayich, or that seemingly should be Shayich to Esav. Yaakov has 3 months, seemingly Esav should also have 3 months. The Zohar, however, says that Esav ended up only getting 2 months. The months of Tammuz and the month of Av. And within the month of Elul, he's not found, he sort of lost the month of Elul. Elul is not his. Furthermore, even in Chodesh Av, he only gets the first 9 days and no more than that. So we see there's a major difference over here between Chodesh Av, and specifically the days after Tisha B'Av, and Elul. So we say like this: Oile Rasha is hinting to Elul itself. In other words, here we're breaking the Ra and the Rasha right from the outset. We're not even giving him any room, any time at all. That means, seemingly it's a month that you say maybe should have belonged to Esav, but we're not even giving him any space at all. He's completely eradicated from Elul. He doesn't belong there at all. Oile Shchenoi was saying is, even in a time that seemingly, to a certain extent, had a shaychus to Esav, we're saying no, we break that as well, and from Tisha B'Av, he's completely lost and not found there either. In fact, says the Rebbe, this is why the Korban Nesanel says, explains it based on this Zohar, that in regards to Chodesh Av, we say that a person that has a court case with a goy should try to avoid it, but that's only till after Tisha B'Av. Because again, after Tisha B'Av is a totally different story, and it doesn't belong to Klippa anymore. Says the Rebbe, however, the tachlis of breaking the Ra is that through all of this, of course, there should be a Hisafa also in the Asay Toiv and the Gili of Oir. And so too, the tachlis of breaking the Ra in Chodesh Av, that we get to a Toisvus or to additional light. The Inyan of, that it becomes Menachem of, that after we break all the dinim, all the negativity and the Ra, the Oile Rasha, of every single day, also of the 9 days, it becomes the of itself, this of aspect itself becomes menachem. That is that we get the double comfort. Nachmu nachmu ami. And furthermore, as it says in one of the Haftorahs that start off, Anoichi Anoichi Hu menachemchem, that Hashem himself comforts the Yidden. And then we go straight into Chodesh Elul, which is the Chodesh Harachamim, the Amshach of the Yud Gimel Midis Harachamim, which are higher than Ishtalshalos, which this is an introduction and a preparation to the Ksiv of Chsimat Toiva Rosh Hashanah, which every single Yid is nechtav, is written and sealed immediately in the Sefer of Tzadikim Gemurim.